Richard Avedon is unquestionably the greatest fashion photographer to have ever lived, but do not make the mistake in limiting his work to that one genre. Over the decades of his career, Avedon not only displayed popular culture, he took part in its creation. From his early work at Harper's Bazaar to his political portraiture, Richard Avedon revolutionized the profession of photography. Born in 1923, Richard Avedon was raised in an environment that incubated his artistic style.
Father had a woman's specialty shop. It was called on Fifth Avenue. Yeah. It was called Avedon's Fifth Avenue. Yeah. And Harper's Bazaar, Vanity Fair, and Vogue were in the house every month because they had to be kept up to date with what was going on in the fashion business. So I saw the most beautiful photographs by Munkachi, by Steichen, by Bruhl, of theater, and of fashion, and the ones I liked, instead of putting baseball players' Dixie cup tops on my wall, I just tore them up and scotch taped them onto the wall, and I was surrounded by the great photography of the 30s as a sort of a visual influence. My father was a teacher, and he explained the principles of photography to me, because the Eastman Kodak box brownie was the big event in the mid-1920s when I was born, late 1920s. Every house had a box brownie, and it was so exciting to take photographs. And my father wanted me to understand what a negative was, what light on a negative did, and how a negative then reversed the process and printed on a sensitized paper. Right. And I was 9 years old. So he did it with a magnifying glass, and so I was burning the edge of the carpets off and setting the drapes on fire. And then I kept thinking, burning in. Now, I had this beautiful little sister. She was absolutely wonderful. And we photographed her all the time because she loved to pose, and she was so pretty. And I took a negative of my sister, and I taped it with, we didn't have Scotch tape, we had surgical tape in the house, onto my shoulder, went out in the sun, went to the beach, actually, and spent the whole day. The sun burned through, and I peeled it off the next morning, and there was my sister on my skin. Now, as a metaphor, that's pretty hot.
After dropping out of Columbia University in 1942, Avedon joined the Merchant Marines, serving as photographer's mate second class. He left after 2 years of service, and that is where his journey as a professional photographer took off.
And I was like 19 or 20, and I went straight from the Merchant Marine, which meant straight from my home, to my mother, my new chosen mother, father, and crazy aunt. Brilliant crazy aunt. Brodovich was the father. He was really very much like my father. Very withdrawn and disciplined and very strong values. And then there was Carmel Snow. So the humanity came from Carmel Snow. Then there was Deanna Vreeland, the eccentric, the crazy aunt in the family who just exploded with imagination.
Under the care of these mentors at Harper's Bazaar, Avedon's photographic style had the room to flourish. In the 1930s and 40s, models posed like statues, beautiful and stoic, but Richard Avedon brought movement and life to his photographs. While accompanying Carmel Snow to shoot the new collections, Avedon was able to capture the glamour of pre-war Paris.
Paris was not like Paris at all. You know, it was in rubbles. Everything was bombed out. And the French industry and the fashion magazines wanted him to photograph the elegance of Paris, but it didn't exist. So he went and he created sets. When he put someone at a pinball machine, the bistro was not like that. So when you see the people, the women coming out of their limousines, that was imagination.
By showing his version of Paris in the pages of Harper's Bazaar, the readers were transported to a new realm of beauty, and even the designers were affected. His photographs of Marella Agnelli for the April 1954 issue of Harper's Bazaar influenced the work of Christian Dior's next collection. During one of these trips in 1955, Avedon enlisted the help of a few local performers at the Cirque d'Hiver, and with the help of Dovima in a Christian Dior gown, captured the single most acclaimed photo in the history of fashion photography. Dovima, Sunny Hartnett, and Susie Parker filled Avedon's photos in the 1950s, but a young actress by the name of Audrey Hepburn became a true muse for him. In the 1957 film Funny Face, Fred Astaire plays Dick Avery, a role inspired by Richard Avedon, who was a visual consultant for the film. With the help of Kay Thompson as Maggie Prescott, the Diane Vreeland-inspired editor of the fictitious Quality magazine, They discover Audrey Hepburn's character, Jo Stockton, in a bookstore and proclaim her the new face of the decade.
Dick was very involved with the making of that movie as a special consultant, yet he was abandoned by the studio midway. Once he regaled me of tales about working on Funny Face and how much the studio hated him after they began shooting. They considered him over-involved, a nuisance, and he insisted that they once drugged him at lunch to keep him away from the editing room. According to him, he was their worst nightmare from start to finish. He found problems with everything, from camera angles to finished color processes. He described it as something he regretted getting involved with, which was baffling to me, seeing as how it's such a great and lasting document of his world.
Although it was not a big box office success during its original theatrical release, the film is full of beauty and charm, and it solidified a friendship between Avedon and Hepburn that started a few years prior during her first visit to his studio in 1953 after shooting Roman Holiday, a role that would earn Hepburn her first Academy Award. They would continue to work together throughout their careers, something Avedon cherished greatly. There is another model involved in Funny Face whose story is intertwined with Avedon's pursuit of beauty, regardless of boundaries.
Richard Avedon and Harper's Bazaar in Balenciaga and Givenchy were the ultimate. Just when I started to model, they were doing Funny Face, and I joined Givenchy as a house model. I was the body of Audrey Hepburn. I mean, they'd have a mannequin of her, and then, when they wanted to see whether it would move right, there I was in that thing moving around.
Machado came to New York City in September 1958, her first time in front of the camera being at Avedon's studio, resulting in this iconic photograph. Although Diana Vreeland supported Avedon's creative control and choice in the models, the publisher of Harper's Bazaar, Robert McLeod, wanted to cut all of the images with Machado, but Avedon refused to remove them and would continue to shoot her for subsequent issues of Harper's Bazaar. Only decades later did Machado discover how strongly Avedon fought for her, and that this ongoing argument drove Avedon to leave Harper's Bazaar and begin his contract shooting for Vogue under their new editor-in-chief, Diana Vreeland. One of his first assignments at Vogue was the now infamous Great Fur Caravan with fashion editor Polly Mellon. Known as the most luxurious and expensive editorial ever done in fashion, one that cost over $1 million in 1966, the Great Fur Caravan was shot over 5 weeks traveling across Japan. The only directive given to the team from Diana Vreeland was to invoke the tale of Genji, the first novel in the world written by a woman, and that it should tell the story of an epic love affair between Verushka and a Japanese man. Avedon wanted to find a man taller than Verushka to play her lover, which led them on a search across the country.
We went to all of the wrestling matches to find this man, which was very difficult. And then we heard about this man, and he was 7 feet and some inches.
Was a sumo wrestler who was thin and much taller than me. I mean, he was so tall that he couldn't sit in the car. I mean, we had to take out the front seat, so he had his sitting in the back of the car. He had such a powerful breathing that he would take a cigarette to... It was finished, cigarette. And the next one came. And we were just always looking at this man who had never seen anything like that.
With the 1960s came a new energy, a new look, something Diana Vreeland and Richard Avedon were acutely in tune with. When Vreeland brought a young British model named Twiggy over to the States in 1967, the photos with Avedon launched her on a global scale, a fervor only intensified by Beatlemania. In front of Avedon's lens, Twiggy transformed from the knock-kneed schoolgirl into a woman, an icon. Twiggy grew up poring over his photographs, but her admiration only grew after working together with him. Her first year since being discovered was full of stagnant posing, but with Dick, it was the first time she ever had to move in front of the camera, and he had her leaping across the set. This photo shows Avedon demonstrating to Twiggy what movement he wanted, and when she saw the contact sheet and asked for this image, he cut it out for her, and she carried it in her wallet for years. The swinging 60s were also a time of deep unrest in the United States, with growing tensions over the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. Avedon may be better known for his fashion photography, but his portraiture and reportage work ran parallel to the fashion. Richard Avedon and high school friend and writer James Baldwin collaborated on the book Nothing Personal, a snapshot of American culture in the 1960s. It featured civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., William Casby, one of the last living Americans born into slavery, as well as the commander of the American Nazi Party. The photos were beautiful, arresting, often disturbing, but they reflected the America outside the glossy pages of the fashion magazines. One of Avedon's skills as a portrait photographer came in part from his use of the camera as a weapon, not a mirror to reflect back what the sitter wanted to show.
When I do a portrait, I have many choices to be completely subjective, balance subjectivity with objectivity, or completely objective.
Even from his earliest days, he was not one to shy away from a conflict, as is seen in this unpublished photograph of Coco Chanel in 1948, which she banned Harper's Bazaar from publishing. Coco Chanel attempted to seize control from her Jewish business partners by arguing to German officials that les parfums Chanel were Jewish property and that they should be turned over to her, but she was outsmarted by the Wertheimer family, who had preemptively given their stake in the company to a Christian friend of theirs. With the fall of the Nazi occupation, Coco Chanel, also known as Nazi Agent 7124, avoided jail time for treason and owed taxes by giving full control to the Wertheimer family. Avedon would continue to work with the brand for decades, including shooting their fragrance campaigns for Chanel No. 5. Coco Chanel was not the only Nazi sympathizer to complain about their portrait by Avedon.
There are times when it's necessary to trick a sitter into what you want, but never for the sake of the trick. I would go every night to the casino in Nice, and I watched them. I watched the way she was with him, the way he was with her, the way they were with people. I wanted to bring out the loss of humanity in them, not the meanness, and there was a lot of meanness and a lot of narcissism, so that I knew exactly what I had to try to accomplish during the sitting. I photographed them in their hotel suite in New York, and they had their pug dogs, which they adored, and they had their Ladies' Home Journal cover faces on. They were posing royally, and nothing, not for a second, was anything that I'd observed when they were gambling presented to me. And I did a kind of, it's like living by your wits. I knew they loved their dogs. And I said, if I seem a little hesitant, a little disturbed, it's because my taxi ran over a dog. And both of their faces dropped because they love dogs a lot more than they love Jews.
Despite there often being a dissonance from how the sitter saw themselves and the captured image, Avedon took portraits of everyone from the political elite to the greatest artists of the 20th century.
To sit with Avedon and have him look at you is a fairly disconcerting experience because you realize that he's studying you. I don't know whether he's seeing inside you or not. I guess he would say he's not.
I think I'm some kind of a reader, some kind of a... I mean, I used to love handwriting analysis, but that's nothing compared to reading a face. I think if I had decided to go into the fortune-telling business, or whatever you call it, I probably would have been very good. What happens to me is that in work, I look for something in a face, and what I look for is contradiction, complexity, things that are contradictory and at the same time connected.
Movement is a common element in Avedon's photographs, so it is no surprise how strongly he was able to relate to musicians throughout his career. From the Beatles to Bob Dylan, Streisand to Sondheim, his portraits were as dynamic as those he captured.
I work out of a series of no's. No to distracting elements in a photograph. No to exquisite light. No to certain subject matter. Certain people are not people I can express myself through. No to props. All these no's force me into the yes. And I have no help. I have a white background, I have the person I'm interested in, and the thing that happens between us. There was one time when the face was like an explosion. For years, it was this explosion. When an explosion happens, you don't know where it's going to fly, where it's going to go, where the teeth are going to be, where the eye is going to be, what the contradictions are going to be within the face. Is this the laugh cynical? Is it ironic? Is it pain? Is it a scream? Is it all this concerned me. Didn't concern me, just overtook me, and they were all facets of my feelings at that time, those years, that month, that day. Then later, very quiet, just very quiet. Everything needed to be very quiet, very uncomposed, very unexplosive.
Avedon's portraits of actors like Marilyn Monroe and Audrey Hepburn are some of his best-known works, but when photographing actress Nastassja Kinski, a true moment of brilliance was captured.
When you look at the photograph, it all looks so easy. She spent 2 hours on a cement floor naked. The snake the trainer would start anchoring the snake with her ankles and then see where the snake would go. Hope that the snake, because there's no talking to a snake, that snake would creep up Nastassja in a way that was beautiful. Meanwhile, she'd roll back, she'd fall forward, the snake would come, the snake trainer would come and move the snake from one part of her body to another. I would catch pictures of his legs, flying out of the frame, but he'd be in the frame, the snake was going. It was really sort of a fashion hell.
And the snake started up her legs. She opened up one leg, the snake wound up her little naked body.
Calm and strong, smooth, big muscle.
And up onto her shoulder and go towards her face. And I said, Nastassja, this is it. Quickly, relax.
And when it got to her ear, he kissed her with his tongue, and Dick got the picture. And I was crying.
She rose to the moment, the snake rose to the moment, I rose to the moment, and it was one of those absolutely magical things that happen when nothing you planned could equal the random
and I
accident
wasn't
of something
terrified,
beautiful.
I wasn't afraid. A wonderful feeling, actually. I love animals.
I couldn't speak. It was extraordinary, sexual, seductive, special, rare moment. And Dick Avedon caught the one time that snake kissed her ear.
When it came to shooting commercial work, Avedon infused his own signature style into the images, blurring the lines between art and commerce, as well as developing a visual vocabulary for those brands that continued for decades. Revlon was one of the earlier big brands that he established a relationship with, dating back to his early work with Susie Parker. The Unforgettable Women campaign was a defining moment for the company, one which fashion designer Isaac Mizrahi writes about in his memoir, I Am.
They were designed as double-page spreads with 4 or 5 gorgeous women from all different generations. Christy Turlington, Iman, Tatiana Patiz, Cindy Crawford, Rachel Williams, Lauren Hutton. One day, Julie called and asked me about a piece from my first collection and whether I could make it for her in black by the following week. I taxied up with my garment bag for an extra early call that day. When I got there, Dick wasn't in his usual jeans, but instead in a gray flannel suit and tie. He seemed more anxious than usual. I said, "What's with the suit?" And he said, "For the great one, I wear a suit." Audrey Hepburn walked in wearing a black raincoat to the knee, a kerchief over her hair, and dark glasses. Dick took me over and introduced us, then left us alone to make further preparations. When we were alone, I froze, but she immediately made me feel at ease. When she saw the coat on the hanger, she sighed and said, "Beautiful," in a vocal expression of hers I'd noted before, which sounded almost like crying. Sitting on the set that day, watching her and Dick work together was like witnessing a miracle. Dick said, "Okay, now, Audrey, look down. And each time you look up at me, I want something fresh and new." She looked down, then up with a half smile, then down, then up with a mysterious gaze, and so on, down, up, with a huge grin, snap, snap. My coat looked flawless, and her neck looked about a mile long. Her hand was in the shot, touching the big ruffle around her neck. I remember the discussions at Dick's studio afterwards. The art directors felt her hand looked too big. So in the end, they swapped it out for that of a hand model. And if you look at the picture now, the hand seems way too small.
It's fun. The food is good. The thing is silly. And the people you meet are... the respect that I have for the hairdressers, for the art directors, for the account executives, and what they live through with their clients who don't get what they're trying to do. It's like a little circus of intention, of hard, disciplined, crafted work to sell. This is a capitalist country, to sell the products that are made that people seem to want.
A perfect example of Avedon's blend of art and commerce is his work for June Ropé.
Lauren, that's fantastic.
June Ropé was a material company, I believe. And Dick said to them, well, let us dispense with the actual business. He said, all you have to do is sell the dream. You have to sell an illusion. You have to show an idea of glamour and associate your name with it. And this was a very early idea.
We were driving. The truck was down. First he wasn't worried, but the car went out of control. And we bashed into the truck once,
everybody
twice,
out.
3 times.
Angel. Angel, dear. Hold it.
He woke up, and she was slumped over the wheel of her car.
Okay, everybody out. Angel.
He didn't think then whether she was dead or not. And then
He's here. Get the film.
Nimm dich in Acht vor ihren schönen Haaren. Vor diesem Schmuck, mit dem sie einzig prangt, wenn sie damit den jungen Mann erlangt.
Arguably his most impactful, controversial, and iconic work was for a young designer named Calvin Klein, who was launching a denim collection.
You want to know what comes between me and my Calvins? Nothing.
Nobody was allowed on the set. I think because Avedon, it was his foray into the commercial world, I think he was a bit nervous. Stakes were pretty high, and I think there was a lot of pressure. So we did multiple takes of everything.
An entirely new species.
The choreography was specific and intentional. Every single bit of it. Ending in the pose with the one knee up, which is, a lot for a 15-year-old to try to figure out, but the more intense, the better for me.
Whenever I get some money, I buy Calvins. And if there's any left, I pay the rent.
I was just so proud that they were trusting me with something that involved acting as well as just the visual. And it was either gonna strike and be a part of the zeitgeist or it wasn't.
Calvin, beautiful conqueror. So that's what happened to me. I've been Calvinized.
It was going to be wordplay or historical references or literary references. There was a real sort of intellectual spin on how they were going to produce these.
Reading is to the mind what Calvin's are to the body.
Yeah. At 56, I can go back and look at the camera and say, oh, well, it's zooming in. Yeah, sort of on my crotch area, and then it comes to my face. Like, okay, but sex has sold since the dawn of time. Every single cover I've ever been on, I don't care if I was 15 or whatever, there's something in the eyes. If they had intended on the double entendre, they didn't explain it to me. If they had explained it to me, why? Would they have wanted me to say it differently? It didn't faze me. It didn't come into my sort of psyche as it being anything overtly sexualized in any way. I feel like the controversy backfired. The campaign was extremely successful. And then I think the underwear sort of overtook the jeans, and they understood what sells.
I'd rather some passion, even if it's a screaming fight. Anything but indifference. You know, when it's not love, and it's not hate, and it's not sex. It's not anything, really. Just one more bad habit you've got to break.
Be hot. Be cool. Just be.
CKB, the fragrance for people. Calvin Klein.
Those first campaigns for Calvin Klein were integral to the young designer's success, but there was another up-and-comer in the 1980s whose brand identity Avedon was able to fortify, and that is of Gianni Versace. The pairing of Versace and Avedon was one of the rare moments in fashion history where an emerging designer and fashion photographer come together to create a mythology that lasts beyond the lives of both men. The early campaigns in the 1980s with models like Janice Dickinson, Beverly Johnson, and Jerry Hall were full of glamour, but the 90s brought on the era of the supermodels, and this recipe was perfected. Avedon and Versace were famous for their unbridled energy and passion for all things beautiful, which created an environment on set where the models were delighted to work. Versace trusted Avedon completely, so Gianni picked the clothes and the rest was for Dick to decide. Kristen McMenemy described her campaign with Nadia Auerman as the most inspired shoot she has ever done. Dick was so excited to be shooting them, so the two women threw themselves into the moment, giving themselves up completely to the work. The chemistry between Kristen, Nadia, and Avedon created some of the best imagery in Versace's history. Not only did Gianni trust Dick, but Dick trusted the models as well. Even when there was a choreographer on set, Dick would let the models discover the poses rather than coming into the shoot with a rigid idea that he wanted the models to simply execute. For the Spring-Summer 1993 campaign, the supermodels depict glamorous warriors in gray sand dunes, in what fashion editor Glenda Bailey called an absolute surrender to glamour, and Naomi Campbell explained that even in that moment, you knew you were creating something special. Stephanie Seymour explained that before each picture, he would gather all the models together and describe the story he wanted to tell and what parts he wanted each of them to play. The resulting images were steeped in drama and narrative, which echoed the Baroque flair that was part of the Versace DNA. The visionary talent of Gianni Versace was tragically ended when he was murdered on the steps of his Miami Beach home, but the transcendent photographs that resulted in his collaboration with Dick Avedon have kept his legacy alive decades later. In the midst of shooting these high-glamour fantasy images for Versace, Avedon embarked on a mission to show the humble reality of how many Americans were living, which culminated in his series, The American West.
7 years you spent about the American West, photographing the American West and the characters out there, and we must have some of these here, I'm sure. Then that was different, though, because you chose them, and you almost chose them because they expressed some idea that you had rather than what they might express on their own.
Exactly. Now, so we have two things going. First of all, it was in the Reagan years. Everything was wonderful, and I went out west.
Morning in America. Morning in America.
Absolutely, Morning in America. And I went out west to do this body of work because I knew that since I had never done the working man, I had done only the people I knew, power, entertainers, artists, fashion, that that my portrait of America would never be complete unless I attempted at least, and I certainly didn't think I could succeed at all. I went out there. There was no John Wayne, except in the Marlborough as they worshipped. There were, the steel mills had folded, the farm, you know what happened to farming, you know what happened to the oil boom. I went out, and those people in the book that are called drifters, they weren't drifting because it was fun. They were looking all over the West for the next job. And my heart was, broken. Also, the sense of there's something about people who are not, I've been so used to people who are aware of the camera and had a great sense of self-image. I never realized the depth that I could go to with people who were thrilled to be photographed. It wasn't boring
for them.
Photograph
me, they would say, almost.
That's right. You want to photograph me, and also I'm looking so dirty, and then I would say, look, I don't want to photograph you in your Sunday best. You have those pictures. I want to show in my pictures what you look like when you're working, when you're in waiting on table, when you're on the road.
And what do you think they thought about?
Well, you can't generalize, but there were an enormous amount of there was an enormous amount of response from, not an enormous, but many friends that were developed through that, that loved it, that came to the show in Fort Worth when it first opened. They were proud to be photographed, the little boy who turned his daughter upside down.
Yeah.
And, you know.
All right.
So it's very mixed. I'm so sure some didn't like them. This never happened. I created it without any idea of how I was going to photograph it or who I was going to photograph. I drew it after it came to me in a dream. I thought of it as the way a painter would think of what he wanted to paint. I put advertisements in the beekeeping journals, and I explained that I needed someone who would permit bees to be on their body.
So I can still remember going past and under the trees, all these packages of bees. And I said, oh my God, they're packaged bees. And Dr. Gary said, don't worry, everything's under control. Richard Avedon said, now remember, you can't move because any movement will be a blur. At which point my knees were starting to shake a little bit, and I said, well, how am I going to overcome that? And I just sort of locked my knees in, and hopefully I didn't move.
Dick was very, very good with people, and he had a sense of himself as an artist. And so he worked for a whole year photographing people, and then he said to the miners, I'll be back next year and I'll show you what I've done. And so he went to a coal mine and on the side of a Quonset hut of the coal mine, where they would go in to shower after working on a shift. He had an exhibition, and it was very moving. We got there early. We had put the pictures up on the exterior wall of the Quonset hut, and when the miners came to work in the morning, they saw themselves from the year before, and they saw other miners from other mines that they may have known or may not have known. So it was quite interesting to see them. Their reaction. And it was a wonderful thing. I mean, I think it was something, Dick didn't have to do it. It was something that he was interested in, to see the subject's reaction to his work. And what was very interesting was that the subjects and people who lived in the West knew much more about these portraits. Instinctively and just looking at them, they responded more positively than people from the art world, because people from the art world actually didn't like the pictures. Other photographers didn't like them. Curators didn't like them. Museums didn't like them. They thought, who does this fashion photographer think he is going out into the West? I was very surprised by the negative reaction of people to the pictures. I thought, do they not go into these same hardware stores, and do they not go to the county fairs?
In 1992, Avedon became the first staff photographer at The New Yorker, and just as he did for Harper's Bazaar and Vogue, he helped redefine the magazine. Up until his arrival, The New Yorker rarely featured any photography, but editor Tina Brown's inclusion of his portrait of Malcolm X became the first full-page photograph in the magazine's history. After years of no longer shooting fashion editorials, In Memory of the Late Mr. and Mrs. Comfort broke boundaries of what fashion editorials could be.
In those days, I felt that I had pockets of my work. Yeah. Fashion was fashion, and then my serious work, and then my portraiture, and then reportage. And in actuality, it's all serious. And the fashion magazines, Vogue, didn't want the way in which I was thinking. I can't divide fashion from the way we live. We don't just have teenage girls leaning over pianos with their backsides up. We all dress. We all want to dress well. We're good people. And I thought, why can't I merge everything I feel socially, what I feel about a little bit about the way we live, into a fashion story? But there was no magazine that was interested in it. But I thought after about 2 years of thinking about this that I would go to Tina and offer it to her. Tina, you know, is the editor of The New Yorker, right. Tina Brown, and I said, Tina, I'd like to try to invest, but as a matter of fact, I asked her up for breakfast, and I had Mr. Comfort dressed in a bathrobe sitting at the table, and I said, this is who I would like to pair with Nadja Auermann, the great German model, as the couple who are living in a world where they've sort of forgotten what everything means. It's a little post-apocalyptic, it's a little after the end of everything, and they're just going on. And she said, go, do it. I'll give you 12 pages. I brought in 26, and she looked at them and published them.
Yeah. This is a fable of the late Mr. and Mrs. Comfort. Why this model?
Which one?
Nastassja.
Nastassja. She's one of the great, beginning to be one of the great actress models, which is different from being an actress in the films, because a model has to hold a moment and express many, many things in a held moment. An actress goes right on to the next line. So it's a very special quality, and she has this quality. She became Mrs. Comfort.
This is the late Mr. and Mrs. Comfort. There is Nastassja. Very stylized. Just tell me about the photograph.
Well, it's not so stylized. They live in this house. Things have, if you look at the back and you'll see it again, things have fallen apart. They have a strange memory of what things used to be like. And here, they're having their picture. They're taking their own picture. If you see, he's got the cable release.
Right.
This is some broken camera.
Right.
They remember that there was such a thing as pictures, but they want to be remembered. That the doll, their child, has a cracked head. He's a skeleton, but they're people, and they're good people, and they've dressed for their picture. This is how they would like us to remember them.
All right. Here is the next one. This is what?
Well, this comes much later, and this is the storm. This is the crucial moment in the middle of the story where everything is gone. These are the things they believed in. There was faith. There was family. There was money. Look at that. There's $100 bills are flying around. The child is flying in the storm. Poor Mr. Comfort's holding onto her skirt. That's all he's got left. The baby carriage. The camera that you saw in the first picture is blowing in the wind. And after the storm, when you get to the real story, you see how she begins to change in her character and in he changes in his desires for her.
All right, and this one?
There they are in the library. It's a library of burnt books. You can't quite see it, but the books are in a refrigerator. They've forgotten what refrigerators were for. They've forgotten what books were for. But maybe some grandparent once said, you know, books are wonderful things. There used to be things called books. And this is very meaningful in The New Yorker, which is a literary magazine. Yes. And they go in there when they're in a sort of nostalgic mood for they know not what. And he's sort of dreaming and she's a little bit lost, but they feel comfortable in the burnt library. That's just Sunday at the television set. They're just in the rusty couch and they're just enjoying themselves.
Yeah. How long was this in production?
I thought about it for about 2 years, took 2 months to really prepare it in 7 days.
Yeah. And how is it different from anything you have done?
The content. The fact that the fashion is part of a thinking world, and also it's about people. It isn't just about models.
Yeah. And what did Dune Arbus and Polly Mellon do?
Oh, wonderful. Polly Mellon is the world's greatest fashion editor. Yeah. And her discipline was she couldn't show a beautiful dress that didn't apply to the story.
Right.
You had to, if you saw her in the library, she had to be wearing what she would wear in the library. So it wasn't just a fashion show. It was really like costuming a film. And Dune Arbus has worked with me forever. We did Chanel commercials and Calvin Klein obsession commercials. She's the woman who wrote Nothing Comes Between Me and My Calvins. And we work hand...
You've been working since 1971.
Yes, with her on all kinds of projects. She's a writer.
Richard Avedon died in San Antonio, Texas on October 1st, 2004. He was there shooting Iraqi veterans on a new project called Democracy that focused on the run-up of the 2004 U.S. presidential elections. With one of the most referenced portfolios in the history of photography spanning over 50 years, his immortality is found in a body of work that continues to inspire so many.